Hi, American literature friends. This is a video going over On the Road by Jack Kerouac. And we are going to be covering the very beginning of the novel and the very end of the novel, which if you've got a book, you know that's what they cover. It's sort of obvious why they picked those sections of the book. What it does is highlight, the book is often read as the great American road trip novel. There are 4 road trips that the novel covers. It covers these road trips that the main characters take from 1947 over the next several years. But what they have decided in the book and what you get at the very beginning of the novel and at the very end is, as much as this is a novel about road trips and cars and the interstate system and driving all across the country and having all these different experiences as you road trip across the country, it is also very clearly about this friendship between these 2 main characters, Sal Paradise and Dean Moriarty. The main character, the narrator of the story is this character named Sal Paradise. And the novel begins when he meets Dean Moriarty, the other main character, who sort of inspires him to go on all these road trips and to leave New York City and to go west to San Francisco, to Denver, to all these different places. And what they've clearly done by picking the beginning and the ending chapters of the book and putting them in our textbook is to sort of highlight the friendship and how what really frames and organizes this book is the story of their friendship and how it starts and then how it ends. When you get to the end, Sal is talking about the very last time he sees Dean. They're in New York City together, but Dean is about to leave to go back to San Francisco. And so what you get, like I said, is the beginning and the ending of their friendship. This book is by Jack Kerouac. Jack Kerouac is often considered the father or the main writer of the Beat generation, although there are several important Beat generation figures. You see, Kerouac was born in 1922. He died in 1969 from heavy alcohol use. Kerouac went to Columbia University on a football scholarship in New York City. But once he got to Columbia, he became friends with a bunch of writers and artists, and it really sort of changed the course of his life. He decided that he was more interested in writing and art and those kinds of things than in playing football and athletics. And so it's really in the 1940s that he dove in and committed himself to being a writer and dove into this intellectual group who have become the Beat generation. The Beat generation now is known for this after World War II. The Beat generation really coincides with the United States after the end of World War II. The late 1940s and especially the 1950s. On the Road was published in 1957, and it becomes the sort of Bible of the Beat generation because of the way that it expresses their sort of belief in like free experience and rejection of the sort of settle down and move to the suburbs and have a couple of kids lifestyle. It is much more invested in this sort of seeking of freedom. You see here is a literary movement started by a group of authors whose work explored and influenced American culture and politics in the post-World War II era. The bulk of their work was published and popularized in the 1950s. The central element of Beat culture are the rejection of standard narrative values. One of the things they were rejecting was the sort of intellectual, deep symbolism of modernism. They are one of the first postmodern literary movements, this rejection of people like Hemingway and Faulkner, and especially T.S. Eliot, and all this deeply intellectual, you have to be super smart to understand what he's writing about. Kerouac especially was trying to tell stories about average, everyday people, but also the sort of wild and epic adventures that are available to them if they reject the sort of model of late 1940s and 1950s, come back from the war, settle down, settle down and start the baby boom. Many of these people came home and their kids became baby boomers. And what you get, and Kerouac belongs to that generation before the people who become the baby boomers. But his response was not to go home and have some baby boomers. It was to, travel across the country and try everything and have all these different experiences. The exploration of America and Eastern religions, the rejection of economic materialism, that is we don't need a house, we don't need 2 cars and all this stuff. They're much more interested in having experiences than accumulating goods. Explicit portrayals of the human condition, experimentation with psychedelic drugs. This is where the Beat Generation transitions into the hippies and the counterculture of the 1960s. Kerouac was not really a part of that. He did not make that transition, but many of the beat writers became sort of leaders of the hippies and the counterculture movement. The main works beside Kerouac's On the Road of the Beat Generation are Howl, a long poem by Allen Ginsberg, and a book called Naked Lunch by William S. Burroughs. Those are the big landmark Beat Generation texts. There's some other ones. And as they tell you here, in the 1960s, elements of the expanding beat movement were incorporated into the hippie and counterculture movement. Neal Cassady became the driver for the Further bus, which is this bus that in the 1960s drove around and let people drop acid and take all these drug experiments and stuff like that. Neal Cassady is the model for the character Dean Moriarty in this book. One of the things you get in On the Road is Sal Paradise is very clearly this version of Jack Kerouac, and Neal Cassady is this version, Dean Moriarty is a version of Neal Cassady. Almost everybody in this book is based on a real people, many of them important figures of the Beat Generation. Like there's a character that you meet in the first chapter of the book called Carlo Marx. He's very clearly based on Allen Ginsberg, the writer who wrote Howl. You see Allen Ginsberg there. And so those are the two things that are important to understand about On the Road. On the Road tells the story of these four sort of epic cross-country road trips that take place over several years, and they also tell the story of this friendship between the two main characters, Sal Paradise, the narrator, and Dean Moriarty, who he meets at the very beginning of the book, and then their friendship ends at the end of the book. Kerouac is also famous for several other books. His other really famous books are The Dharma Bums, which is about him living in San Francisco and his friendships there. Because in many ways, On the Road, the sort of center of On the Road, although it's about these road trips, it often starts from New York City. The Dharma Bums often starts from San Francisco. And then the other book that he is famous for is Big Sur, which is often read as sort of the end of the fun, the end of the adventure, or the hangover after On the Road. It is this much, I don't want to say sadder, but quieter book about Big Sur, which is an area on the California coast south of San Francisco. That's an introduction to Kerouac. That also gives you an introduction to the Beat Generation. Here is Neal Cassady, who, as I said, becomes this really important figure in both the Beat Generation and then the hippies and the counterculture in the 1960s. He and many of the other beat writers were friends. Kerouac and Neal Cassady both died in the late 1960s, Cassady in 1968, and then Jack Kerouac in 1969. But he transitioned from being a part of the Beat Generation to this sort of hippie movement. So you see the real person, Neal Cassady, there. And this is a famous picture of, there's Jack Kerouac, and there's Neal Cassady. That is the cover of On the Road, the famous cover of On the Road. There's also, if you look in D2L, there's a couple of maps that tell you, that cover, you can see here, the 4 maps of the 4 road trips that On the Road covers. This is the first road trip, the one that's at the very beginning of the book, that is at the beginning of our textbook, that starts from New York City and then goes west all the way and ends in Denver. So you can see that. Here is Kerouac's hand-drawn map of all the first road trip of On the Road, which starts in New York. They go to Denver, they go to San Francisco, LA, and then, like I said, he eventually makes his way back to New York. And that's where he is at the very end of the novel. All the road tripping is over. He's back in New York City where he started from. Here's another, this is a Google map of everywhere you would go if you went where he talks about in On the Road on that first trip, which covers the winter of 1947 and then the spring of 1948. So what we're going to do is dive now into the novel. Let's see, here we go. And you can see right here, the novel begins, the novel really kicks off and begins with this description of him becoming friends. I first met Dean not long after my wife and I split up. I had just gotten over a serious illness that I won't bother to talk about. With the coming of Dean Moriarty began the part of my life you could call my life on the road. Before that, I often dreamed of going west to see the country, vaguely planning and never taking off. Dean is the perfect guy for the road because he actually was born on the road, whereas when his parents were passing through Salt Lake City in 1926 on their way to Los Angeles. And so the book kicks off with the beginning of this friendship and him hearing about this guy from some other friends in New York City, and then almost immediately Dean himself shows up in New York City. If you've got a textbook, you will see, let's see if we can scroll down here to where to where they actually meet. You see also here, this is all far back, when Dean was not the way he is today. When he was a young jail kid, you find out that Dean had been in juvenile detention for stealing cars when he was younger. Then news came that Dean was out of reform school, was coming to New York for the first time, and also there was talk that he had just married a girl named Mary Lou. One of the things you get in this book is Dean gets married, gets married and divorced several times. Finally, at the end of the book, Sal has met this girl that he may potentially want to settle down with. Dean is like twice divorced, and is trying to get married a third time, but still living with his second wife in San Francisco. So there is a bunch of this relationships coming and going throughout the novel. And part of what really ends their friendship is Dean finally treats Sal that way. They're on a road trip, they're in Mexico City, and Sal gets sick, and Dean just abandons him too. He finally gets treated the way Dean has treated many of these women throughout the course of the book, and that is what really, Sal is like, all right, I've had enough of this part of my life and this friendship. The flame of this friendship has finally sort of died down. But here at the beginning, there is all this hope and excitement about meeting this guy and starting this part of their life that is the life on the road and all this traveling. They go to meet Dean. I went to the Coldwater Flat. That's a Coldwater Flat was in a cheaper apartment in the 1940s where you didn't have hot. It was called a Coldwater Flat because the apartment was so cheap it didn't have hot water. All you got was cold water. Dean came to the door in his shorts. Mary Lou, that's the first wife, was jumping off the couch. Dean had dispatched the occupant of the apartment to the kitchen, probably to make coffee. My first impression of Dean was of a young Gene Autry. Trim, thin-hipped, blue-eyed, with a real Oklahoma accent, a sideburn hero of the snowy West. In fact, he'd just been working on a ranch, Ed Walls in Colorado, before marrying Mary Lou and coming east. And if you don't know who Gene Autry is, he is a famous actor of the 1940s in all these cowboy movies. And so the suggestion here is that Dean looks like this sort of classic American hero, this sort of like 1930s, 1940s cowboy who's going to take you west and take you on all these adventures and all this stuff. He just looks like this sort of classic American hero of that time period. He meets Dean that night, and he's super interested in him. But after that night, you see where this paragraph ends. Then I went away. During the following week, he confided in Chad King, another friend of theirs, that he absolutely had to learn how to write from him. Chad said I was a writer, and he should come to me for advice. Meanwhile, Dean had gotten a job in a parking lot, had a fight with Mary Lou in their Hoboken apartment. If you don't know Hoboken, it's in New Jersey, right across the river from New York City. Dean had to land from Hoboken, so he had no place to live. He came right out to Patterson, New Jersey, where I was living with my aunt. And one night, there was a knock on the door. And so this is really the kickoff of Dean and Sal's friendship. Hello, you remember me, Dean Moriarty. I've come to ask you to show me how to write. And this is really, like I said, the kickoff of their friendship. Dean and Sal become these sort of, they get energy from each other, but they both like take things from each other too. Dean convinces Sal to go on this on-the-road adventure and like gets him out of New York and gets him traveling around this thing he'd always planned to do but never really gotten around to. Meanwhile, Sal is trying to teach Dean how to write and to be a writer and to sort of tell the stories of all of his adventures. And as you see at the end of this paragraph right here, I agreed that he could stay at my house till he found a job, and furthermore, we agreed to go out west sometime. This was the winter of 1947. And so it'll be the spring of 1948 when this book really kicks into gear. At the end of the section that's in the book, and then if you flip over to the next page in the textbook, you see there's this long section where Sal is trying to write, and Dean is like, no, let's go party, let's go have adventures in New York City. Um, and here it is right here. And a kind of holy lightning I saw flashing from his excitement and his visions, which he describes so torrentially that people in buses looked around to see the overexcited nut. And you get one of the defining characteristics of Dean is this just sort of overflowing energy. He's always ready to go find something, to go on an adventure. You've met people like this. They don't ever want to sit. They're the opposite of low key. They don't ever want to sit down and relax. They always want to get up and go and have something, find something new to do. They can't ever sit down and chill out. We went to New York. I forgot what the situation was. We went to this parking lot. We had a few things to do, and that was the night Dean met Carlo Marx. A tremendous thing happened when Dean met Carlo Marx. Two keen minds that they are, they took to each other at the drop of a hat. From that moment on, I saw very little of Dean, and I was a little sorry too. Their energies met head on. I was a lout compared. I couldn't keep up with them. And this is one of the things that you get from Sal over and over again in this book is, it's not that he's just along for the ride. He's clearly a part of the party and along for the ride. But he is also committed to his writing, and there is some of this like, I'm going to sit here and finish what I'm working on. And Dean is like, no, forget all that. Let's go party, 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 adventure, adventure, adventure. And that is part of what leads near the end of the book to Dean just sort of abandoning him and when he gets sick in Mexico City. You get this long description that has become the sort of famous description of Dean Moriarty and of the Beat generation. Let's see if we can find it in here. The whole, yeah. They rushed down the street together, digging everything in the early way they had, which later became so much sadder. They danced down the street like dingle-doties, and I shambled after, as I've been doing all my life, after people who interest me. Because the only people for me are the mad ones, and this is Dean, and this is why Dean is such a, you want to be friends with him, but he's eventually going to burn you out too. The ones who are mad to live, mad to talk, mad to be saved, desirous of everything at the same time. The ones who never yawn or say a commonplace thing, but burn, 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 like fabulous yellow Roman candles exploding like spiders across the stars. In the middle, you see the blue center light pop, and everybody goes off. Wanting dearly to learn how to write like Carlo, the first thing Dean was attacking him with a great amorous soul. I didn't see them for 2 weeks, during which time they cemented their relationship. And so you get this description of this sort of Beat generation ideology or Beat generation mindset of this sort of burn, 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 and let's always be out, and let's always be trying to have the next experience and the next adventure. The problem with that burn, 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 which is really what ends Dean and Sal's friendship, is when people are like that with each other, they're really, really tight and really good friends, and then eventually they burn each other out. And Dean sort of burns out his friendship with Sal with all this burn, burn, burn. It's very intense and very, this very hot, burning very hot intensity, but then it burns itself out pretty quickly, just like what happens at the end of the book. Then came spring, the great time of traveling, and everybody in the scattered gang was getting ready to take one trip or another. I was busily at work on my novel, and when I came to the halfway mark, after a trip down south with my aunt, I got ready to travel west for the first time. Dean had already left. Carlo and I saw him off at the 34th Street Greyhound station. And so Dean had already left to go back west, to go back to Denver and then to California. But him leaving, Sal is going to catch up with him and join him on these adventures here. And you get that this was really the way, here we go, this is really the way that my whole road experience began, and the things that were to come are too fantastic not to tell. So this is really the beginning of the book, but also the beginning of their friendship, and the sort of road adventures and being on the road is all tied in with their friendship. And in this next little section here, let's see if we can find it here. He also describes why Dean is so appealing. All my New York friends were in the negative, nightmare position of putting down society, giving their tired, bookish, or political or psychoanalytical reasons. But Dean just raced in society, eager for bread, as the old slang for money, eager for money and love. He didn't care one way or another. And so Dean is this sort of positive force when everybody else around Sal is this sort of intellectual negative. They're like, everything's worn out, we're tired of everything. And the appeal of Dean is this sort of, no, we can go out and have new exciting experiences. a Western kinsman of the sun, Dean. And so that's his appeal, is this sort of bright. And then when you get to the end of the book, and let's see if we can find it down here, Dean has finally burned Sal out. And Sal has just had enough of it. Let's get down here. Where Dean finally abandons Sal on this road trip. And Sal learns, maybe I'm disposable too. I'm just like the wives and all the other friends. He can just dump me too when he gets tired of me. And so Dean drives back from Mexico City to see Sal one more time in New York City, but their friendship is really over. Sal has learned that he, like I said, is sort of disposable to Dean, that even he can be left behind when Dean is ready to keep going and Sal is sick. Sal gets sick in New York City. In the fall, I myself started back home from New York City. And one night, just over Laredo border in Dilley, Texas, I was standing on the hot road. And so he comes back into the United States, and then he makes his way back to New York City. I struggled and hurried to New York, and one night I was standing in the dark street in Manhattan and called up to the window of a loft where I thought my friends were having a party. But a pretty girl stuck her head out the window and said, "Yes, who is it?" "Sal Paradise," I said, and heard my name resound in the sad, empty street. "Come up," she said, "I'm making hot chocolate." So I went up, and there she was, the girl with the pure and innocent dear eyes that I'd always searched for, and for so long. We agreed to love each other madly. And in the winter, we plan to migrate to San Francisco. And this is what brings Dean back. Dean is going to help them. They're all going to go to San Francisco. They're going to leave New York and live in San Francisco together. Sal and this girl he's fallen in love with, and Dean and his second wife, and by now they've had a couple of kids together. I wrote to Dean and told him. He wrote back a huge letter, 18,000 words, all about his young years in Denver, and said he was coming to get me and personally select the old truck himself and drive us home. But Dean shows up before they've really had time to save up their money and get everything packed up, and so it turns into just this visit that doesn't add up to anything. It's just this sort of sad ending of all of their time together and all of their friendship together. The girl's name is Laura, by the way. You see, "Look, dear Sal, sweet Laura." And so when they meet, when Dean shows up too early, it's just like, "What are you doing here? We haven't saved up enough money. We're not ready to go." And it just becomes this disappointment to everybody involved. And that disappointment ends when Dean just has to get on the bus back to San Francisco, leave New York City. It's cold, it's winter time. He's just in this overcoat, and Sal and his friends already have plans to go to this concert, and they can't break those plans. Let's see if we can scroll down to that part and find that. "Goodbye, Dean." And this is when they're about to go to this concert. Like I said, it was a cold winter night. Dean came too early, and so there's no point in him being there, so he's just going to go back to San Francisco by himself. "Goodbye, Dean," I said. "I sure wish I didn't have to go to the concert." "Do you think I can ride to 40th Street with you?" he whispered. "I want to be with you as much as possible, and it's so darn cold in this here New York." I whispered to Remy, who is Sal's other friend, but he wouldn't have it. He didn't like my idiot friends. I wasn't going to start all over again, ruining his planned evenings. "Absolutely out of the question, Sal." So Dean couldn't ride uptown with us, and the only thing I could do was sit in the back of the Cadillac and wave at him. The bookie at the wheel also wanted nothing to do with Dean. Dean was ragged in a moth-eaten overcoat he bought especially for the freezing temperatures of the East, and he walked off alone, and the last I saw of him, he rounded the corner of 7th Avenue, eyes on the street ahead, and bent to it again. And Sal's girlfriend is sad. She's like, "We shouldn't let him go off like this. What'll he do?" "Old Dean's gone," I thought, and out loud I said, "He'll be all right." And then you get this famous last paragraph of On the Road where Sal thinks about all the adventures they've had together and how they have covered America. They've gone from coast to coast multiple times. So in America, when the sun goes down, and this is the sun going down on their friendship too, I sit on the old broken down river pier watching the long, long skies over New Jersey and sense all that raw land that they have covered back and forth, that taken these road trips in their friendship. And that one unbelievable huge bulge over to the west coast and all that road going, all the people dreaming. I know by now the children must be crying in the land where they let the children cry, and tonight the stars will be out. The evening star must be drooping and shedding her sparkler dims. And so, like I said, it's like the sunset of their friendship, but also the sun is setting on this sort of period of Sal's life where he goes on all these wild road trips and adventures. nobody knows what's going to happen to anybody besides the forlorn rags of growing old. And again, that's part of it because Sal is growing older. He's decided to have this serious relationship with this woman. And so all of his sort of wild times with his guy friends are sort of, the door's closing on that. I think of Dean Moriarty. I even think of old Dean Moriarty, the father we never found. That's Dean's dad. And I think of Dean Moriarty. And so it's this sort of, he thinks about Dean and this friendship that they have, but he also knows that period of time had to come to an end. But it is, for Sal, it becomes the sort of story of what America is this time period where he crossed and recrossed the country, had all these adventures with his friends. And so On the Road is this story of being on the road and going, on all these road trips across the country and seeing all these exciting things. But it's also this story of being this particular age, with this particular group of friends, and then that period coming to an end. As you can see right here, the response for Kerouac asks you, the excerpts in our textbook are from the beginning and the ending of On the Road, and they depict the beginning and end of Sal and Dean's friendship. What do they show or suggest about why they become such immediate and close friends, as well as about why that friendship finally comes to an end? So this prompt is really just asking you, why does their friendship start, and then how does it end, is what it's really asking you to think about. How does this thing flare up, and then how does it die down? If you have questions about Jack Kerouac, if you have questions about On the Road, which was published in 1957, and like I said, it's considered one of the great American novels. It has become the sort of Bible of the Beat generation and of that sort of counterculture pushback against the late 1940s and 1950s, when so many people came back from World War II, and it was very clearly the sort of most wealthy and successful time for America. Many people came back, and everybody could afford, 2 cars and a home and everybody could afford a house in the suburbs. And President Eisenhower, there was this period after World War II of long sort of stability with President Eisenhower as president. He built the interstate system, which figures into this book. And it was this period of sort of growth and stability, but for a lot of people like Jack Kerouac, that growth and stability, that was one model of success that felt sort of stifling to people like Jack Kerouac and the rest of the Beat generation, and they didn't want to just settle down and start having kids and buy a car and buy a house and all that stuff. They sort of rejected that in favor of, at least for a while, having these wild adventures and seeing America and stuff like this. If you have questions about that, about the Beat generation, about Kerouac, about this response, about Neal Cassady, who becomes this important sort of countercultural figure for about 20 years, just be in touch and we can dig into it further, and I'll be happy to help talk you through or answer any questions that you have. Otherwise, I hope this was useful in helping you to understand On the Road and the Beat generation. Thanks.